One of the first questions that comes up when you talk about Harrison's secret life is, how did he achieve so much? How could he sustain the willpower to go so far in life? Well, you can chalk it up to two things. One, his insatiable ambition, and two, the influence of his religion, the Buddhist sect of Taho.
At 14 years of age, Harrison's parents enrolled him in Hampden Sydney College, a small Presbyterian school in Hanover County, Virginia. It was expected that he would be further prepared there for a privileged life like his father's. But only a few weeks into his stay, he had an encounter with a Taho missionary, which would alter the course of his entire life.
Harrison was taking a walk about a mile or so from campus when he came upon a man sitting motionless beneath a tree. Harrison, fearing the man was dead, approached him and forcefully struck him once across the face. William hadn't yet received his medical training, obviously. The man then opened his eyes, blood streaming from his nose, and started laughing. Now, Harrison was stunned and pretty freaked out. What kind of man would laugh after having his nose broken, right? So he sat down and started talking with him, and over the course of the next several weeks, Harrison began to study Taho with the man and learned all he could about his disgusting religion. Taho was founded in 1535 by a discontented, passive-aggressive Frenchman who wanted to establish his own religion and secure himself a place in history. His name has long since been forgotten. What makes Taho so disturbing is its perversion of everything significant about Buddhism. Take Buddhism's core principle. Life is suffering. Taho's core principle is suffering is suffering. There's a well-known parable that the Buddha could live on a grain of rice a day. Apparently, the founder of Taho could thrive on pure bullshit. There is one thing about Taho that is remarkable. Its meditation practice. With it, they have been able to develop complete control over their body functions. Members of Taho can even slow down their aging process. This is significant as far as Harrison's ability to live for so long after his death.
On March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison was sworn in as the 9th President of the United States of America. He had achieved his goal, the highest office in the land, and from the outset, he hated it.
It really didn't offer him the power that he wanted. He was constantly being approached by people who wanted some office or governorship somewhere. There were people who wanted him to create a cabinet-level position just for them. He really had no time for himself or to do anything presidential, and that was driving him crazy.
It was about that time that a man walked into his office, startled Harrison, and identified himself as somebody called Deep Orifice. And Harrison thought maybe he was one of these disappointed office seekers that politicians have to deal with a lot, tried to brush him off, and then this character started to explain why he had come and whom he represented.
Its full name was Fraternitas Pro Americas Memoria Seditiosus, or, in English, the Fraternity for the American Revolutionary Tradition. Now, it was founded by several members from the Second Continental Congress, and its original charter was reputed to have looked almost identical to the Declaration of Independence with regard to its signatories. The people who founded this country, the main guys, the forefathers, that's this group.
Harrison was skeptical, but then Deep Orifice dropped the bombshell that Harrison's father was a founding member of the fraternity and that he had specifically requested that his son be initiated when the time was right.
And it all just came together in his mind. Things he remembered about his father from his youth, strange trips, odd collections of books, mysterious acquaintances, suddenly all made sense to him. So he agreed to go with Deep Orifice to a meeting of the fraternity and check it out.
That night, Deep Orifice led Harrison into a secret basement beneath the Washington Monument. Led only by candlelight, Harrison at last entered a large chamber where he stood confronting a mass of hooded and robed people. As he looked around the circle, he discovered that this was truly a gathering of the greatest minds and most powerful people in the country. One of them, Henry Clay, stepped forward and told Harrison that they wanted him to join and that if he was willing, he would become a spy for them.
Then Clay told him that the best spies were dead to the world, and if he wanted to join, he would have to abandon his former life, his family, his friends, even his wife, and fake his own death. It would be a very tough decision, but after weighing it over for several minutes, he finally agreed.
It was a rainy day in the beginning of April, less than a month after his inauguration. He took a long stroll outside, making certain to get thoroughly soaked. Later that day, he pretended to be sick.
They called in the doctor, Wilhelm Gluck, a confidant of Harrison's father and also a member of the fraternity. He stood there for a moment in mock contemplation before swiftly announcing Harrison's diagnosis, pneumonia.
And there it was. Harrison was pronounced officially dead, and nobody was the wiser. He was now a full-fledged member of the fraternity, and free to pursue his ambitions of power without any of the burdensome checks of democracy.
The official record, of course, has William Henry Harrison dying shortly after his inauguration. He spent very little time as president. But there were these recurring stories, particularly as you moved west through the Allegheny Mountains, across the Ohio River into Ohio and Indiana. You would talk to storekeepers in these little crossroads villages, these little general stores, and they all had stories about seeing William Henry Harrison long after his death.
When you're a popular dead president trying to escape your country to become a part of a shadowy organization, chances are you're going to get recognized once or twice. And Harrison was. There were a few reports of hauntings and some urban legends cropped up, but the fraternity bribed most of the witnesses into silence.
In the decade following Harrison's journey west, he traveled the world, staying out of the American public's radar and developing his role as fraternity spy and liaison. It wasn't until 1853 when he resurfaced in South America, where he would remain and wreak havoc for more than 30 years.
His objective was to start wars and foment rebellions so that the United States could increase its sphere of influence in South America. But Harrison was not best prepared for the job. His Spanish was, to put it mildly, atrocious. Yet surprisingly, this worked to his advantage more often than not.
One example was the War of the Pacific, which began when Harrison, posing as a Chilean ambassador, accidentally called for a mass circumcision of all cucumbers in the countries of Peru and Bolivia. The Peruvian and Bolivian leaders, thinking cucumbers to be a euphemism, united against Chile.
Everywhere that Harrison went, this unintentional chaos would follow. It wasn't long before stories started developing of this lone American, stories of his manipulation, his power, his almost supernatural ability to foster discord and chaos. And like any story about a shadowy figure like Harrison, these started to evolve and take on a life of their own. Harrison gained a new name as a new legend was born. The legend of the Wandering Gringo.
Myths of the Wandering Gringo flourished in this period throughout the region. Every country had a story of this mysterious creature. It was like the Bigfoot stories. Every shadow, every unexplained occurrence was attributed to the Wandering Gringo.
While more than a little confused at his effectiveness, Harrison eventually embraced the persona of the Wandering Gringo. The aura of fear that it created around him made it much easier to get things done. And as time passed, Harrison only got better at channeling this power, and South America continued to suffer from his disruptive presence. After 33 years had passed, Harrison returned north, his mission complete. He had been disconnected with American life for so long now that his overriding desire was to reconnect with his family. The best way to do this, he thought, was to help his grandson, Benjamin Harrison, win the presidency in the 1888 election. He spoke with the fraternity about helping Ben, and they agreed that he was an ideal candidate. Not one to waste time, one day later, Harrison snuck into Ben's house and left him a note on his pillow. It is said that it read, "Ben, I missed you. Come out back."
He was just trying to be intriguing, I guess, stir up Benjamin's interest. But apparently note leaving was something that Benjamin and his wife did quite often. So when he went out back, he did so in the nude.
Benjamin Harrison, naked, just stared at his grandfather. And his grandfather stared back, neither of them sure of exactly what to do. Eventually, William Henry spoke up and told Benjamin who he was and that he wanted to help him win the presidency. There was a moment of stunned silence. This man, who didn't look a day over 60, was his long-dead grandfather. It was all a little too unreal for him. But he looked into the elder Harrison's eyes and through the memories of old family portraits recognized him. Benjamin recovered his composure and accepted William Henry's help. The two embraced awkwardly. As they separated, William gave Benjamin his hat as a token of goodwill and also to cover himself back up. He was making William a bit uncomfortable.
This was actually the first significant moment in Benjamin's campaign for president. It was this gesture that gave Benjamin his campaign slogan, "Grandfather's hat fits Ben."
With the help of the fraternity, they easily won the election, but the big result was that Ben and William Henry grew really close. So much so that early into Ben's term, he started ignoring orders from the fraternity and began taking advice from his grandfather instead. Now, one of the core principles of the fraternity was that the inner circle always had final say, and anyone breaking this rule was immediately kicked out, permanently, without debate or discussion. Well, Ben and William Henry were popular with many of the lower-ranking members, but the inner circle, they didn't care. They kicked both Harrisons out, and then they made sure that Ben lost when he ran for re-election in 1892. This would prove to be a big mistake.
The ensuing fallout of William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison's expulsion from the fraternity, and then Benjamin Harrison's defeat in the 1892 election, was massive. William Henry had never felt more betrayed. The group that he had faithfully served for over 4 decades had abandoned him without hesitation or remorse. He was determined to make this something they would come to regret.
Harrison's thirst for revenge consumed him. He was determined to tear apart the ranks of the fraternity. If they were so fearful of a possible coup, well, he would realize their fears and go after their leadership. Harrison would be the new leader of the fraternity.
1 week into the new year, Harrison put his anger into action. He stormed into a fraternity meeting, knocked out the guards, and challenged each and every member of the fraternity to a duel of pistols.
Well, the leaders of the fraternity wanted to have Harrison shot right then and there, but he still had too many supporters and admirers within the fraternity to do this, so the inner circle agreed to the duels. Either Harrison would be killed a few rounds in, which would be a simple solution to this problem, or he would wipe out the entire fraternity, which they all knew was a laughable impossibility.
Harrison shot most of them in the face just to make a point. They didn't really have much of a chance. He was an ace shot. But in spite of the deaths of a couple dozen low-ranking members, there was a husband and wife catering team, an up-and-coming circus clown named Kooks, there were others. It wasn't until he killed a high-ranking member of the fraternity, ex-President Rutherford B. Hayes, that people really started to get worried. They had to cover up the truth behind Hay's death, so they said it was a heart attack. And this was really the sort of situation they didn't want happening again, because too many mysterious deaths could expose them, and that would really suck a big one, because, after all, their power stemmed from being a secret society.
So the fraternity started to stall. It really seemed that if Harrison had his way, every single fraternity member would be killed. But they betrayed none of this fear and instead taunted Harrison into accepting much more difficult challenges, ones designed virtually to guarantee that no one would die or even be hit. They challenged Harrison that he couldn't win a duel from 10,000 paces. He couldn't. They made a bet that Harrison couldn't win a duel with a chicken tied to his face. He couldn't. They even got him to duel a fraternity member underwater, which, predictably, didn't work either.
After a year or so of this, Harrison's impatience reached the breaking point. He told the leaders of the fraternity that if they refused to fight duels as God had intended, he would personally hunt each one of them down and shoot them where they stood.
These guys were just terrified. They knew that Harrison was a man of his word and that he would make good on his threats. And so the way the end game unfolded, they very reluctantly agreed that they would relinquish control, and William Henry Harrison was sworn in as the new leader.
Harrison had a short term as president of the fraternity, but it started with a bang. His main objective was to establish the United States as an imperial power, and his first step to doing this was to kick Spain out of the region. Spain had control of several islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and Harrison saw them as easy targets. So Harrison boarded the battleship Maine and headed down to Cuba, Spain's main colony, to scout the area.
You know, funny story. Harrison had given the sailors the day off, and they had just discovered how much fun helium was, you know, with the little slices, little chipmunk slices. And so they were opening all these canisters of helium, and they accidentally opened a canister of hydrogen too. And nobody noticed when one of the sailors was going to light a cigarette, and he struck the match, and the ship exploded, killing over 200 men. That was funnier in my head.
Harrison was on shore when he heard the explosion. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he knew an opportunity when he saw it. He immediately called President William McKinley, another fraternity member, and he told him to blame the incident on the Spanish. 2 months later, the Spanish-American War had begun.
The war itself was an easy victory for the United States. They routed the Spanish in Cuba with the help of Teddy Roosevelt and San Juan Hill, and Admiral Dewey in the Pacific beat them pretty handily there. So suddenly, you know, the United States is the proud protector of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, with Cuba given its full independence, but very much within the American sphere of influence.
Now, the military victory was complete, but Harrison was in very dangerous waters within the fraternity. There were a lot of fraternity members who were very angry and bitter about the way that he had risen to power, and a small fraction of them, led by ex-President Grover Cleveland, were working actively to oust him. Cleveland founded something called the Anti-Imperialist League, which recruited congressmen and senators to block most of Harrison's legislative agendas, but worse was Grover Cleveland's attack campaign led by the famous Mark Twain. Twain put a series of slanderous articles in the fraternity newsletter, including satirical poems, making fun of Harrison. As these grew in popularity, Harrison became a laughingstock.
Then my grandfather would kind of pick up where Mr. Clemens left off and just let Harrison have it with both barrels. So finally, I think old William Henry just had to he couldn't take it. He just plain and simply couldn't take it. Maybe it was because he was, 100 and something years old. He couldn't take it. He just kind of slunk off to wherever.
It was bad. Harrison got to the point where he would see Cleveland everywhere. He would try to get away, get some time to himself, to regroup, collect his thoughts. But everywhere he went, there Cleveland was, in one way or another. And when he wasn't seeing Cleveland, he was seeing Twain.
The result of all this was that Harrison just fell deeper and deeper into anxiety and depression. There seemed nothing he could do to regain the power and prestige that Cleveland and Twain were so readily taking away from him. He couldn't handle it, and eventually he had a nervous breakdown.
For the first time in his life, William Henry Harrison gave up. He conceded defeat to the League, gave up his leadership of the fraternity, and then abruptly he just disappeared. And so the story goes that Harrison left the country and went to China to spend the rest of his life in a Taho monastery there. The Anti-Imperialist League dissolved a few years later, but Cleveland was content. He had defeated the man that he had considered the greatest threat to the world. But Harrison, before he disappeared, had left his mark. He had set into motion the great juggernaut of American imperialism, which only gathered steam in the following century.
Do you really know what you think you know? Would you ever know if what you think you know, you don't? Everybody hears it all the time, how all the guys in charge are running around in the underground, pulling strings and changing things, telling lies and strategizing, changing all our lives. And I don't know what you've been told, but there are so many things that you don't know. And here's another one about William Henry Harrison, a guy who once was president, and they said he was dead, but it was a long time before death caught up to him, and before it did, he left his prints on just about everyone. If you want to know more, listen up to Amanda Delacourt. She'll tell you the triumph of William Henry Harrison.